Alrighty. I was once told that when you're presenting something, it's a measure of your skills if you can get the projector to show the pictures of your slides. There we go. Good morning. Glad to see so many of you here, and people in the live stream, make a note of the after party. I'll meet you all there. I hope it will fit everybody in here. Let's talk a bit about Azure and security and AI and everything that sort of boggles the mind and keeps us busy this year and I think for the foreseeable future. To get to know me, I would like to say go to Google and Google me, you get to know me, but for some reason that doesn't work anymore. Let's get back to that in a bit. But there's been 3 defining events in my life that has brought me here, and I hope you here as well. The first one was a VIC-20 that my parents had a foresight to acquire in 1982. I was at the ripe age of 5. Anybody else here using VIC-20? There's 1, 2, yes, I like you already. And if somebody's thinking I wasn't born yet in 1982, that's fine, you can still stay here. And if you do a raise of hands in the live stream, that's great as well. I cannot see you, but you're sort of participating properly. And then Microsoft came out with MS-DOS 3.3, that's my absolute favorite. 6.0 was okay-ish, 3.4, we don't really talk about that. But perhaps one thing that has sort of modified me more than I care to admit, in a couple of years ago, my 3rd son was born, and at the same time I was building a house. I was at the summer cabin enjoying my short summer holiday, and the contractor called me and said, Jussi, we have a huge problem now. I sent the problem to you in Excel. This is the Excel that I got. It is the tightness of the land mass of the excavation that we need to do for the house. And there's a measurement, which is the purple bars, the result of that, and then there's the requirement, which is about 2.2 of something, I don't know what it means. And they said, yeah, you're not going to pass on this one. And I had spent a lot of money and time to get to that point. So we had a couple of really frantic days trying to figure out how do we tighten the landmass so that it can sustain a house. And finally, I knew nothing else to do. I called the guy who did the measurements and said, I've got 5 people who have been working 20 years in the construction sites. They don't know what to do. So can you give us some advice? How can we fix this? The guy goes, what do you mean? You don't have a problem. I said, well, it's below the requirement. Oh, no, the Excel is upside down. It's actually over the requirement. So you're all good. I'm like, okay. This probably modified my thinking more than I care to admit. Alrighty, so we'll talk a bit about Azure today, then we hop on to generative AI. I promise not to spend too much time on Copilot because you are all using all the Copilots. The latest number I've heard is that Microsoft has 64 Copilot services. Then there's one number, 142 Copilot services, because you can factor in each individual capability in GitHub Copilot Chat as a separate Copilot SKU. And then let's talk about security. And the sort of underlying message throughout this morning for you is that we all need to learn to eat more vegetables. There's a story behind this. If you have great questions, I do have a positive broccoli. I'm happy to hand these out. I have a couple of these with me. If you're remotely on the live stream, hop in the taxi, get here, so you have a chance to get this. Alrighty, so quick show of hands, how many of you identify yourself as a developer? Somebody who lives in VS Code, Visual Studio. Some people prefer using Vim for some reason. Okay, about 10 people. How about how many of you identify as an IT pro, architect, enterprise architect, meaning mostly PowerPoints? Not too many, a couple. And lastly, how many of you identify as managers, C-suite, CISOs, CEOs, people who manage? Okay, about 1/4. Good stuff, good stuff. So let's talk about Microsoft Azure. I was working at Microsoft. I had just relocated to Dublin, Ireland. I wanted to see the world. I applied to all Microsoft offices in the world where I knew I could speak the language or I could learn the language. So France was out immediately. But Dublin welcomed me with open arms. I was at the office one evening because we like to do long days there. And there was an email from Ray Ozzie at the time. He was the CTO at Microsoft. And he sent a message that Red Dog is now available for internal consumption. And I was like, I've heard of this. And what he meant was Windows Azure, because Steve Ballmer had the foresight to call it Windows Azure, because obviously nothing else would run in the cloud. You want to run Windows in there. And I whipped out my laptop. At the time, this was 2008, October-ish. At the time, Azure was a setup.exe. You would download that from the file share, not from SharePoint, obviously, and then you do setup next, reboot, and you would get this super great XML file that allowed you to configure how many instances of the web and worker roles you would like to run. This was Azure at the time. I reached out to the product group at some point to ask, so why is it called Red Dog internally again? They're like, well, it's not official, but sort of the story is that we were driving around maybe in Texas and we wanted to have a great code name for Azure. And there was maybe a gentleman's club nearby that was called Pink Poodle. So we needed this to be something more aggressive, so it became Red Dog. And then we got Silverlight. My oldest son was born at the same year that Microsoft brought out Silverlight. And I'm not sure which shaped my thinking more, the birth of my son or Silverlight. I did sit at a couple of Microsoft events doing Silverlight labs. It took about 60 minutes to get a clock face that had the second hand going through in 60 seconds. Then you would complete that and you were a Silverlight expert. And then Microsoft again had the foresight to build the whole admin interface to Azure with Silverlight. And I'm still not really sure why they chose that, but I'm super happy they didn't stick with that. But at the time, Azure was relatively simple, because all you had to do was to know about 5 services: Azure SQL, storage, web worker roles, and something else that I forgot, maybe Azure Active Directory at the time, which was called Windows Azure Active Directory, because Windows was super important at the time. So that was easy. Today, Azure is about 200 services, depending on how you calculate them. It's impossible to know them all. And I frequently have meetings with customers that I show up in the Teams call at 9 o'clock or at their office at 9 o'clock, and they ask me, Jussi, what do you think about this new public preview feature that was released last night at 3:30 in the morning? I'm like, oh, gee, I don't know, I was sleeping, but let me have a quick look what they announced, so then I can maybe become an expert in that. And then we got the classic Azure. I sort of like this. It was fairly monolithic, meaning the portal was super slow. It was probably running in Redmond. They didn't realize they had users in Europe at the same time. And it sort of worked. It was relatively easy still, but you had to struggle a lot to get stuff running. So in a way, I'm happy that we are up to about 200 services, and you can focus on a subset of those. So when we are thinking of Azure, Eurostat, the ministry in the EU region that is producing statistics like this, the use of public cloud services and platforms in the EU region for enterprises. And perhaps don't focus too much on the enterprise word, because the definition, I did look that up, the definition from Eurostat for an enterprise is an entity of 1 or more persons running a business. So in a way, I have an enterprise myself as well. And the use of cloud computing services in the EU, why am I getting a reminder? I should have Outlook off. The use of cloud computing services, Finland, at the end of 2023, is leading the pack. So Finland is first on the left. We beat the Swedes. That makes me happy. Anybody from Sweden here? No? If somebody on the live stream, you need to make up for this. We'll see you next year. I think we can still beat you. Then Denmark, Ireland, Italy, and so on. Norway, though, is doing relatively well. But if we look at the EU average on the use of cloud computing services, this factors in Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, and so on. If you look at that, the average, it is a hair over 40%, which means there's plenty of ground to cover in terms of utilizing public cloud services, but also for building hybrid still building on premises that might eventually move to the public cloud as well. And sometimes then the total opposite happens. For those of you who work as architects, you've seen this picture 1,000 times. This is the official reference implementation for the enterprise landing zone architecture from Microsoft. It looks great on paper. You have a look at this, you can see your favorites. Active Directory is still there because everybody needs that, right? We have the Entra ID, meaning Azure Active Directory, then a bunch of management groups, dozens of subscriptions so that we can do subscription vending and democratize the whole access for this one. And I've seen dozens of implementations of this, and all of those implementations are carbon copies of this one, because this is what Microsoft made as a reference, so let's use that one. You perhaps use Bicep or Terraform so that you can do it in code. And a couple of times I'm looking or auditing something like this, and I'm asking the customer, so this seems to be running, so any problems you're having with this? And they're like, well, no, it took 18 months to deploy. It cost us 250,000 euros to design. Okay, sounds quite enterprisey. So what do you do with this? Oh, no, we don't have any production workloads yet because we exhausted our resources just to get this sort of framework up and running. And then you start thinking, well, is there perhaps something the other nations in the EU region get that we don't get in the Nordics, because we want to go all in with something like this? So I'm often advocating for something like, this is a nice reference, this is probably not the thing you want to deploy as is, you want to adapt this for the customer. So my own lessons with Azure is, this was in September 2022. I woke up on a gray Monday morning and I get select notifications on my watch. I used to get WhatsApp and Signal and it just lighted up like a Christmas tree. So I get just select notifications on this one, and there was one notification from my online bank. And it said, Microsoft Ireland has been trying to charge you 49,555 euro, but it failed because I didn't have sufficient funds in my account. I was super happy for that. And I was like, okay, let's see what's happening. Is this a phishing attempt? Is this somebody from Microsoft back from my past when I used to live in Dublin asking me for some payback, or is this something else? And there's an email saying that the current cost of my test Azure subscription with a budget of 150 euro is 53,000 euro. The forecast is 325,000 euro. And we're expecting your immediate payment for this 53,000. And I was like, okay, let's start digging on this one. And I spent a couple of hours trying to dig through that. And then I got another alert that that Azure subscription was at 161,000 euro. Spent money, we'd like to get your money immediately, please. I started escalating that to people I know in Redmond, to the official billing and accounting department. I locked down my credit card so they couldn't just forcefully do this. And the reason for this was not that I was doing Bitcoin mining in Azure. That doesn't really work that well. The reason for this was that I was running a public preview software. The software was called Defender External Attack Surface Management, Defender EASM. The whole purpose of that is that you put in assets as seeds, meaning your domain names, AS numbers for routing, web addresses, IP address ranges, and it starts going to the Microsoft signals and graph and databases to build a full picture of your assets, how it looks externally, so that you can understand what you're exposing. And I tried to do that to my personal domain, jussiroine.com. It has one IP address. I figured, let's see how this works. And that failed. And then Microsoft had said, try something else. And what I had tried the previous night, I put cloudflare.com because I figured maybe they have something. They have 80 million assets. One asset is 1 cent per day. So that quite rapidly ramped up the cost for me. And long story short, this took 12 calls, 12 meetings with Microsoft that kept escalating higher and higher. Each call started with, so Jussi, tell us again why you shouldn't be paying us this money. I'm like, well, because I don't think I really consumed this. There's a bug in your system or it's not logical. If I can add one domain in a text box, press enter, and that makes 50,000 euro immediately in cost, that's not how the public cloud should work. How did we end up with? I ended up paying 55 euro. Super happy for that. I didn't have to sell the house. The kids did not have to move under the bridge with me, and we're all good since then. I haven't deployed the service since then, though. So for the past couple of years, I've been working quite deeply with all aspects of security with customers, meaning Azure, Microsoft 365, on-premises, VPNs, Wi-Fi, routing, on-premise deployments, and everything in there. Security goes everywhere. And what I wanted to do after 2 years is, what sort of skills do you need in a fast-paced IT and development environment as a professional to succeed with these customers, these challenges? And I built this mind map. I switched to a MacBook last year, and obviously when you use MacBook, everything is super tiny because you have the resolution is so high. So I did a bit of a zoom in for you. And it really opened my eyes to try to understand that you need to understand an awful lot about infrastructure, not everything, but you still need to understand how Active Directory works, how GPOs are deployed, how do they synchronize, how do you do cloud sync to the cloud. You need to do scripting. PowerShell typically, but I see a lot of people doing Python nowadays. I still struggle a bit to make the hop because they have this weird notation of having tabs in there, and I just can't live with that. And then you have to do data integration, you have to be able to modify endpoints, and primarily everything revolves around identities. And when I say identities, I don't mean that do cloud synchronization from AD to Entra ID and call it a day. That's probably the first step, and then you have about 55 steps to complete on that one. How do you do multi-factor authentication? How do you do single sign-on? How do you synchronize different external systems? And how do you do governance for all of that? Microsoft 365 is interesting in this context, because even if we talk about Azure, a lot of the stuff that the users will be using will be in Microsoft 365, and that bleeds back to Entra ID and all the new capacities in there. And then strictly on Azure side, I often hear from experts nowadays when we start a new project, the first question is, so Jussi, we are doing this project for a customer, we are planning on deploying stuff. Do we use Bicep or Terraform? And that seems to be the defining existential question, which one do we use? And I often say, I don't really care at all, because we are 12 months away from even writing the first line of a Bicep module. We have to design, we have to plan, we have to do the governance, we have to do everything, and then maybe eventually we get to deploy something. And this tells me also that Azure and the projects and deployments that customers want, it has matured quite a bit. So instead of going in and starting on the first day to deploy something, it's much more about the governance, it's much more about managing, planning, designing, and also doing cost management, which I think I'm an expert nowadays. And lastly, everything else, I did add Defender EASM in there, just so you know, to avoid the cost. So generative AI. Microsoft did a nice survey early in 2024. What are the top of mind topics for leadership teams in companies? And generative AI, not surprisingly, was the first major topic everybody is thinking of. To me, this often means, well, everybody's thinking about ChatGPT. How do we use this? How do we integrate this? How do we build a wrapper around ChatGPT and do business with this one? Automation, cybersecurity makes me smile because there's a lot of business in here. But then there's stuff like virtual and augmented reality. And Apple Vision Pro was announced around the time they did this survey, but it didn't seem to make a huge dent in the demand. But I'm looking at quantum computing. There's a session on quantum computing later today, and it's super interesting, but I'm entirely not sure where and how and why would you use it, and that's my limitation, so I need to attend that session as well. A Danish think tank did another study on the expectations of generative AI, meaning that 2/3 of Nordic organizations plan to use it more in the next 3 years. And I think we will all use it more, do we want it or not, automatically or manually. But only half of these organizations expect that AI will make them more competitive. So why would you use it if it doesn't make you more productive, more competitive, give you something extra in there? So my bet in here is that 2 years from now, I will go through a bunch of companies in Finland and look at their financial records. Are they becoming more productive? Are they more profitable? And we are not sure quite yet. We know how to use the services, we know how to build them, we know how to integrate AI to a bunch of things, but is it doing that much to us? And I'm not really sure. Let's talk about this in a second. But only 1/3 expect to use AI in management work. So does this mean that the managers are safe, their jobs are not going away, but the developers, the IT pros, the architects, their work will be automated? I think it will be the opposite around. And I'm not sure which is better, that the manual work that I do gets automated and taken away by AI, or that I would have a manager that would be an AI that would manage how I work. I perhaps prefer the first option in here. So management often wants great generative AI solutions. I've been building a bunch of those, mostly using Azure OpenAI, but often the request nowadays, at least in Finland, is that we want this sort of a solution, but all the data that we plan on feeding, for grounding it and for actually utilizing, all the data needs to remain in Finland. So it cannot leave the boundaries. We cannot run this in West Europe, we cannot run this in Sweden Central, which means we run the inferencing of those models locally. Typically we set up a server with 4 GPUs, a lot of RAM, and run everything in there. It works beautifully. But then we're sort of going back to on-premises and building something local. It warms my heart because it's nice building servers, but at the same time, the expectation is that we're building an Eiffel Tower because everybody's benchmarking against ChatGPT or whatever Microsoft is showcasing. But then when you start building this, and I hear this often from friends who also work in this space, is that, well, the customer said that they have a budget of 3.5 days. What can we build with this? Well, not much we can do. A simple React web interface with a text box that barely works, not optimized for mobile, and then we can call a REST API that calls our Azure OpenAI instance and does a bit of prompt engineering and flows. That's about it. It's far from building an Eiffel Tower. I think it took little bit longer to design and build that as well. So the landscape is, for end users, it's typically ChatGPT. They want to use this one. How many of you here have a paid ChatGPT subscription, the Team or Plus or something else? About 1/3 of the audience have that one. And initially the problem obviously was that we weren't sure how the data that you feed into ChatGPT, how the data would be used to train the models later on. Now they have controls for that, but initially we just started using it. ChatGPT got up to 100 million users. Nobody cared what they pasted in there. And I was a bit worried about that. IT pros, developers prefer Azure OpenAI and probably some other external engines, or they run them locally. And managers, they just want Copilot. They want nothing else. Because they've been hearing how Copilot will save everything, it will automate and optimize your work. In 1st of February, when we got Copilot for Microsoft 365 commercial licensing, I bought the license to everybody in my company. And you could only buy the annual license, meaning you ended up paying about 300 euro per person for the full year. Everybody wanted to have that. 2 days later, I'm asking people, so how are you getting the value from Copilot for Microsoft 365? And somebody said, well, it's not really giving me what I'm expecting it to give me. And since then, it has evolved quite a bit. The best use case I have for generative AI, if somebody were to ask me, what's the best AI productivity tip that you can possibly come up with? It's super simple, but it's relatively great. you need to build a PowerPoint presentation. You go to the web, you find a nice Microsoft Learn article on the main topics that you need. You save that as a Word document, save that to OneDrive, feed that to Copilot for Microsoft 365, and give a nice prompt. Build me 20 slides on this, the main topics are this, 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 and this. Take the pictures, take the structure. It builds a fairly impressive PowerPoint for you in about a minute. And then you can tweak and do whatever you like. I don't use it for this. All of the slides I've built manually. But if I need to do a quick tutorial for something, can you tell us about NIS2? Sure, let me get the base stuff in place so I don't have to do copy-paste and I don't have to think that much. That probably saves me a couple of hours per presentation that I can do. But beyond that, it's mostly tiny, small things that we need to automate, and that's about it. So a real-life example on using generative AI. So what I often do is I run large language models locally. I'm using a MacBook, and it's fairly performant on even the larger models. So this was built with Code Llama. And I had a customer, we were working with something for them, and on a side chat they asked me, so Jussi, we need an Azure SQL database with one table. Roughly the structure should be this, and we need to store the data for 30 years. Can you guarantee it will be stored in Azure for 30 years? And there's some limitations for that. And I said, yeah, this is not a problem. And I know how to do SQL statements, T-SQL. But it's been a couple of years that I really did that. So I fired up Code Llama, I gave it a bit of instructions. I need this, this, and this. Did a couple of prompts, and it gave me this. This took me about 2 minutes. 1 minute to spin up the Code Llama LLM, another minute to do prompting. And I got a fairly nice working SQL statement to create a single table. What do I tell my customer? What's my invoice for this one? Is it 2 minutes out of my hourly rate? Or is it the value that I'm bringing? Can I say, well, this took maybe a day or two to come up with the knowledge to spin all of this up? No, that's not fair. So I ended up charging 30 minutes for this because I needed to think about this for a little bit. Everybody was happy. Then they came back to me and said, well, we need a trigger that when somebody does an insert in the SQL, it needs to add a value in one of the columns with a random value that combines different things. I had the old chat open, meaning I had the grounding and the historical data. I went back to that chat, copy-pasted the request from the customer's email, came here, pressed enter, 10 seconds more, I have a nice-looking trigger. I couldn't come up with this by heart. I would have to look it up. How do I do a trigger with these specific things? And this took an extra 10 seconds. Can I now go back to the customer and say, well, this is an extra 30 minutes because I did the heavy lifting here? No, I'll just let it slide because this is the kind of stuff we used to spend our time on. Now we just get it done and we continue with the actual work. And for the customer, this is probably the actual deliverable. For me, this is a meaningless exercise that takes 2 minutes and it's done and I forget how it even works any longer. But they will probably call me in 29 years and ask, is the data still there? And based on the Finnish official age when you get to retire, I will still be working in IT 29 years from now. So I need to store these PowerPoints to come back with them. But then Microsoft said on LinkedIn that if you use Copilot, you can be in 3 meetings at once. This might be the productivity that they are looking into. I'm a bit worried on this one, and I did dig a little bit deeper. What do they mean with this? It means that you attend one meeting, you do not attend those 2 other meetings, but you're following those meetings because in the new Outlook you have that capability, so that you do not decline or say maybe, but you follow that, but you're not present. Then you get the transcript, and Copilot will go through that transcript and tells you what action points were given to you on those meetings. And people are now asking, could I have like a virtual persona, maybe in the metaverse, that would join the meeting on behalf of me, take notes and respond in my voice when somebody's asking, Jussi, can you do this? And then it would say yes or no. And pretty soon I'm thinking, well, why can't I be on the beach enjoying the sunshine and my virtual personas would attend 15 meetings at a time, get me the action points, and I would have an agent that would complete those? What would be the value? Probably great. What would be my salary then? Probably not that great because I'm not part of that formula anymore. Another case that really opened my eyes is COBOL. Anybody here worked with COBOL in a professional capacity? There's one. I feel your pain already in here. Feel the pain as well. I got a call a year ago in the winter. I got a call from a job agency. They were trying to find somebody to work with COBOL in a professional capacity, and somehow they found me. I don't have COBOL in my LinkedIn profile. I've never worked with COBOL besides looking at somebody else doing COBOL. I feel I'm young and the guy doing COBOL was super old at the time. And they asked me, Jussi, we have a great opportunity for you. You need to relocate to Lapland for 11 months. You need to be at the office 5 days a week at a steel factory, and you need to fix the COBOL that they have. And this will take 11 months. How about it? I'm like super tempted, but let me think, let me talk with my family. I spoke with my wife, so what do you think if we, move to Lapland, get the real winter experience and see Santa and everything else, and I get to work in COBOL? She was like, yeah, you can go and I'll change the locks in the meantime. Let's see how that goes. But what I did do, I went to Google and all the COBOL books from 1985, they're public domain now. So you can download all the books if you really want to learn COBOL. I downloaded all the PDF books, I fed them to my locally hosted Gen AI LLMs, and I asked it, can you teach me COBOL now? How do I do hello world? How do I do this? How do I do that? And I got immediate answers on all of those, and they seem to work. I started thinking, could the virtual Jussi relocate to Lapland and work in an office where the door is locked, and whatever requests they have to fix COBOL, I would just do them virtually with AI. I tried proposing that approach, that I would get the full salary, I would stay here in Helsinki, but I would fix the COBOL problems, and if they have things, they would email me. They were like, no, this is not how it's going to work. You have to be there physically at the steel factory to witness the beauty of creating steel. So we didn't come to a deal. Another example, and this is probably a lesson for me because there were some things I was super rusty on. There's a free software called LM Studio. It runs on macOS, Linux, and Windows as well. This is how it looks, and you can tell it's a great software because the logo is made in ASCII, just like in 1995. So this always implies to me this is something awesome. What you can do with this is you can download openly available large language models and small language models as well. So what I ended up doing, I ended up downloading Phi 3 from Microsoft, which is a small language models, runs on the edge, meaning Raspberry Pis and devices with less capabilities, but it runs super fast on a laptop as well. So you download Phi 3, and then when you've downloaded that one, it can host a REST API for you locally, meaning that it spins up a server which is compatible with OpenAI REST API. So you can do your development locally, and when everything works, you just point it to your Azure OpenAI or your OpenAI instance, and that way you save up on those tokens when you're doing development. And the nice thing is that it gives you a curl example to try. How does this work? So you do curl localhost, blah, 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 and then it gives you the response back from Phi 3 or other models that you choose to use. So I spun this up, and once I had it up, I was like, well, I'd like to create a web page that now talks to the REST API that I have locally. And the web page needs to be in HTML, nothing fancy. So I go to GitHub Copilot chat in VS Code, and I give it the curl statement. This is the curl statement, the endpoint request. Give me an HTML page that conforms to this one. I don't really want to think anymore. I perhaps know how to do this, but I don't want to spend any time on this anymore because this is meaningless in the sense that I would just want to get it up and running. Then I can tweak it further. GitHub Copilot thinks for maybe 10 seconds. It gives me a nice looking HTML. There's some weird stuff like the fetch. I was like, well, this didn't exist in 1998 when I studied HTML, so this is new. And it correctly picked up everything, even the sample roles always answer in rhymes, it says. I needed to tweak that one. And if it calls the API that I'm hosting locally, if it gets the response back from the small language model that I'm hosting, instead of printing that conveniently for me, it's dumping that in the console log, which is the best place to get debugging messages. I was like, this is awesome. I'm almost like a developer now. It took me 2 minutes to get here. So I run this, but it starts complaining about cores and missing origin and all those things that typically penalize you in Azure. And I was like, so how do I get around this? Because the HTML file is local, I cannot really fake cores. So it's telling me, well, now you need to embrace the beauty of Node.js and host it or this on Node.js to actually get it up and running. And there's probably not too many things I hate more than Node.js, so I figured, help me out here. And it gives me this. So you have an API server.js that has a couple of requires in here, and then it's actually doing the posting directly. So the HTML page is calling this one, and then it's subsequently calling that one. And it's listening on port 4000, but my LLM or SLM is on a different port, so this gets awfully complex quite fast. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just getting code and hitting next, next, next. This is like back in the day with Stack Overflow. You just copy-paste something, it works. It's great. So I run this, but now it complains that, how do I run Node.js? So I ask for that, and then it complains about not finding module Express. And I can again go back to GitHub Copilot to ask, how do I run Express? Well, you need to do npm install Express. You get 350,000 JavaScript files locally, but this is awesome, it's super great. I'm glad you chose Node.js and not C# or something more modern. Finally, with all this, it works. I have a browser with a single button. When you click this one, it calls to the API that I'm hosting locally. Nothing happens. But if you press F12, go to DevTools console, it is telling you that this is what we're getting back from here. Again, this took maybe 5 minutes, mostly done with Gen AI. I didn't need to know anything. Perhaps I wouldn't deploy this to production quite yet because VS Code doesn't have right-click publish. But if I ported this to Visual Studio, I could do right-click publish and it would be production ready, really. So again, the meaningless stuff, super easy to do, but I don't really understand what's happening in here. I can read the code, but I haven't internalized that, what is really happening in here. And that's probably the same effect we had for those of you who had a driver's license in the 1990s. The cars didn't have a GPS device at the time. We started getting the TomTom devices at some point. Now most cars have the embedded GPS. So before the time we had GPS, you had a paper map. I was doing a road trip in Barcelona in 1996. And my girlfriend then, she was navigating. We had a huge paper map. And I'm yelling at her, which turn to take. And she's like, I don't know where we are. And we're sort of in that phase, a little bit past that one. We have the rudimentary TomTom devices, but nothing super fancy yet, and we're getting there. So a friendly reminder that we should all eat more vegetables. I started a challenge with myself that I need to learn to eat more vegetables, and I started with broccoli because I've always disliked broccoli quite a bit. And if you go to temu.com, you can order positive broccoli plush toys. I have a few extra of these, so if you find me later today, I can hand this out, perhaps. Try to get you to eat more vegetables as well. I read a study that by the time you turn 50, you start losing 1% of your muscle mass unless you do something about it. And I figured, let me eat more broccoli, let me do a little bit more sports, so that by the time I'm 75, before I retire, I can still get out from bed, fire up my VS Code, and actually get productive stuff done. So if you've been thinking, should I eat more vegetables? Yes, we should all eat more vegetables. So I really like Mac OS. It gives me all sorts of things when I'm presenting. Windows never does this for me. Briefly on the language models. Are we in here? There we go. So OpenAI obviously nowadays mostly dominates this space. GPT 3.5 Turbo, super efficient, super cost optimized for most reasoning, for most summarizations you need to do. Then you go for the fancier stuff with GPT-4, obviously. And Azure OpenAI obviously has access to all of these as well, and you would typically use Azure AI Studio. I rarely need the old Azure OpenAI Studio. The new AI Studio is much more capable in that sense. This is the worldview that I often see with customers. GPT this, GPT that, which version, and let's just get cracking on the solution. But Meta came out with Llama 3, and they are sharing that openly. The largest one is the one with 70 billion parameters, and the rumor is they're building one with 400 billion parameters. And by the time that comes out, I need to upgrade my MacBook because it's not capable of running that. I frequently use these two when I'm doing something locally, or if there's a requirement that we cannot put stuff in the cloud. These two are super capable for that. Microsoft Phi 3, nice combination to any of these if you need faster results, faster summarization, but not that much reasoning for complex topics. And some other ones, I wanted to highlight Wizard LM2, which is almost equal to Llama 3 in terms of performance and capabilities. And they announced that about a month ago. I happen to be online, I click download, I'm hosting it, oh, this looks great. I point to my colleagues, oh, try this one out. They go, it's not available anymore. I was like, no, it was there online just an hour ago. No, but it's not anymore. And then there's a message, yeah, we had to pull out that from release because we forgot to censor all of the content that shouldn't be in a large language model. So you got the uncensored version. And I was like, well, this is great, I'm never leaving this. But now we got the censored version and all the fun stuff is away from there. Alrighty, a bit on security. Eurovision 2024. That is the reason why if you Google me, I am not on the front page anymore of Google. I used to be, I was a little bit proud of that. The reason for this is that Finland's participant to Eurovision 2024 in Sweden was a guy named Windows 95 Man, and the guy who did the lyrics happens to have the same name as me. So I've had people call me in the past weeks to ask for autographs and if I could do appearances at events. I'm like, yeah, I'll just leave you with this picture. And this is not the same person, sadly. So now if you need to Google me, click on the second page of Google and you will find me. One thing that we don't know how to build anymore, this is probably due to Azure, automating quite a bit of stuff, is an experience I had with a customer a couple of months ago. I was in a call. They said, well, Jussi, now that you're here in the call and you seem to be fairly knowledgeable about stuff, can you help us debug our locally hosted Windows file server cluster with DFS replicas integrated to Active Directory? I'm like, well, it's 2024. I did this last in 2012. Yeah, but you probably know this stuff by your heart. So let's just quickly hop into this one. And there's a guy who shares his screen. He has literally 8 RDP sessions, like in the Inception movies. He has 17 different MMC consoles running. He clicks through all of them and says, here's the problem, what do we do? I'm like, well, if you click on view and refresh, let's see if it's updated. And everything is red. He clicks view, refresh, everything becomes green. They're like, see, Jussi, we knew you know this stuff. It's fixed already. I'm like, yeah, I know my stuff for sure. Let's close this and let's not talk about this ever again. So Microsoft came up with the idea that wouldn't it be great if your Windows 11 took a screenshot every 2 seconds, stored that without encryption on your hard drive? Would that be great? Everybody goes, yes, that's great. So Windows Recall available starting in June for devices that meet certain criteria, meaning that they have to have the ARM silicon, the NPU chip in there, enough disk space, and at least 16 gigs of RAM. It's an interesting aspect. I, for sure, will be working with my customers to disable this. There's a GPO already available in Windows Server 2025, where you can just flat out disable this, unless you're the Darth Vader and you work as a manager and you want to capture everything your employees are doing, then do enable this. Otherwise, you want to keep this off. Couple of quick insights from Microsoft why security is hard. This is from the past winter. Microsoft surveyed their customers through their consultancy services to check what sort of challenges customers have. In secure Active Directory configuration, 43% of customers surveyed had insecure Active Directory configuration. Active Directory became available in December 1999, so 25 years ago roughly. And about half of the customers do not know how to configure it. Perhaps we need to move on. Perhaps we need to secure this somehow. So what they came out with was Copilot for security, which means security meets AI. And Copilot for security, if you're looking at this picture, it looks awfully the same as Copilot for Microsoft 365 because it's using exactly the same approach. They just changed the icons in here to make it look different. The idea is that it pulls all data from all of your central security systems like Microsoft Sentinel, Defender for Cloud, Microsoft Defender, and then you can do prompting to ask, do we have any problems we need to worry about? They came out with the concept of SCU, the Security Compute Unit, which is $4 an hour, and you need at least one. So bare minimum for Copilot for security will cost you about $34,000 a year. This is bare minimum. For production use, the recommendation is 3 SCUs, which is of about 100,000 a year to do prompting. But if you're really serious, you go for 10 at least, which is $345,000. So what I want to quickly try, let's hop to my browser, let's reload the page. This is Copilot for security. I can ask it to do all sorts of things. Make me a KQL query to find all Windows 11 24H2 devices. Let's do something like this. So it's thinking for a little bit, and it's firing up the plugins. This takes about a minute to do. And I'm running this with 1 SCU, so it's relatively slow. If you want to crank up the SCUs, you can go to settings. Each SCU will bring you more cost. So if this is too slow, what you can do is you go to owner settings, and you come in here and say, I want more. If you go for 10, no, we don't allow that. You have to manually click it like this. And the estimated monthly cost is something. So what I want to achieve is more speed and performance. And I have fresh in mind the problems I had with costs and billing with Microsoft. So 100 is the most one. When you click apply, it immediately charges the first hour. So $4 times 100, $400. Let's go with this. And please somebody remind me after my session that Jussi, you need to scale that back down. Otherwise I need to sell my house. Is it any faster? Let's go in here. Let's open the old session. 49 seconds. Let's try again. Make it again. It's exactly as slow as it used to be. But at least we spent $400 on this nice experience. Alrighty, quickly, last before we wrap up, some advice I'd like to give to 20-year-old me. You don't need to do page numbers in PowerPoint slides. I see a lot of people doing this because they want to print the slides. Nobody prints those. If you have an email signature that says, think of the trees, don't print this, you don't need that signature either. And the last bit is, don't spend months and months in 1998 learning regular expressions. Generative AI will do it for you automatically. Lastly, on security, there's all sorts of great things you can do, but it all boils down to this. Deploy Defender XDR, which means endpoint protection. Deploy Defender for Cloud, the reasonable Sentinel deployment. You're better than 98% of deployments that I'm seeing when you just deploy these aspects. In closing, build a strong foundation to succeed with Azure and security and generative AI. Build at least 1 or 2 super deep dive areas where you want to be in. For me, those are security and utilizing Gen AI with infrastructure. Not probably being the developer for that, but utilizing those the best I can see. and fiddle with all the new previews and services in your home lab. We also had a requirement to have an ice bear, a polar bear in the presentations, so I hope I've achieved that requirement as well. Thank you, enjoy IglooConf, and have a nice day.